Go to Hebrews in chapter 10. I want you to notice here in verse 32. It says here, Hebrews in chapter 10, and let's look here in verse 32. But remember the former days, in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. The writer of Hebrews, some believe it's Paul. We don't fully know. Some would say Apollos. There are different talks about who really it is. But the writer here, what we do know is who he's writing to, is to believers that many of them Jewish believers that had came out of Judaism and I would say just out of the regulations and laws and rituals. But they had been persecuted severely. In fact, we notice this in this part here where he says that in verse 34, you had compassion on me in my chains. And this is where some would say this may be Paul because he had been in prison at times. And yet he goes on to say that they joyfully accepted the plundering of their goods. Why? Because in the midst of this, then there were ones that ended up taking from them as well because of their belief in Christ. They faced suffering and persecution, and yet he says to them, the fact is that even in the midst of all of this, you still were joyful. Why? You still endured because you know that you had a better place waiting for you. You knew that you had a home waiting for you in heaven. He tells them that they endured. Why is he saying this, though? Because in time, after much persecution and hardship, but also after many that began to try to pose doubts of Christ and who he is and whether Jesus was enough. That's really the fact of it. When you go through Hebrews, the question for them began to be, is Jesus enough for our lives? So the writer of Hebrews is reminding them, he's enough. He's better than anything that that's ever come along. Christ is much better. And he's trying to remind them that the faith they had before, they had their focus simply on Christ. And they endured. And he says, remember those former days. Trying to remind them. Because in time, they did get to the point where they were confused, discouraged, and doubting, questioning. And so this is where he reminds them. And he tells them to continue and endure because they will have a reward. Well, then I want you to go to Hebrews 11. Hebrews in chapter 11. Now much of this here, this chapter would be called, some have termed it the Hall of Faith. Because the writer here is letting them know, giving depictions, different examples of ones in the Old Testament that followed in faith, followed the revelation that they had received of the coming of the Messiah. They didn't have the full picture, but what they did have, they believed and they pressed on in faith. And one of them, he talks about Abraham. He talks about Jacob and Isaac. But then here in chapter 11, he says in verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, which they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. And by faith Moses, when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, the passing pleasures of sin. He says Moses chose And when we go back and we read about that, yes, Moses could have. He could have remained in Egypt. He could have remained in the place that he was and had a good, we would say, a good, successful life there in Egypt. But the fact was, Moses also knew that he was a Hebrew. He saw the suffering and the hardship that the Israelites, what was happening to them. And he chose. In fact, when you go and you read about how Moses tried to take matters in his own hand, it didn't work out too well. What does he do? He ends up seeing an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and so he goes and he kills the Egyptian and hides him away, and he thinks that nobody knows about it. But then it's found out. It's found out, and what does he do? He flees. Pharaoh seeks for his life. But here the writer is reminding them, saying of Moses, that Moses chose. He could have simply looked away from their sufferings and said, well, I'm here in Egypt now, and I'm high up in position, and I'm going to live my life, just enjoy the things I have. But he didn't do it. He chose rather to suffer with the people of God. He says he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked for the reward. Now again, this sense of looking and focusing on a reward that's to come. It's very interesting that he says that he esteemed the reproach of Christ. He's almost talking as if Moses had actually known of Jesus Christ. Very interesting language that he's writing by. He goes on to say here, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Now again, that word, the term that he's dealing with the ruler, it's not necessarily termed as king, but it would be as the Pharaoh, but not fearing the wrath. Why? Notice, because he endured. He endured as seeing him who is invisible. Again, very interesting. Because somehow, in some way, Moses, he saw God who's invisible. He's saying God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. But how does Moses see God? Well, then you have to go back and realize Jesus said to Philip. You remember he told Philip, he said, if you have seen me, you have seen who? The Father. When you read where Moses there was 40 days on the mount and receiving the commands of God, what was he doing? As you're reading that, he's talking with God as God is a person. It's not just simply God speaking to him in the clouds or in the sky. God is there with Moses. Who is that? It was Christ. Christ. Moses knew of Jesus Christ. When you read the Old Testament, you've got to realize that Christ was involved so much in the Old Testament, far more than you ever realized. So this is where Moses prays and he says, show me your glory. Show me your glory. So we see here the writer of Hebrews stating that he endured. Why? Because he had faith. And because he saw Christ. He experienced and had that fellowship with him. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. He goes on and on. He says, what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to talk of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. I could continue on and on talking about those who had faith in the promise. They had faith. They subdued kingdoms. They worked righteousness. They obtained promises. They stopped the mouths of lions. Who is he talking about here? Well, it would probably be Daniel. He says, they quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness they were made strong. They became valiant in battle. They turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned and they were sawn in two. The reality here that there were some that actually some of the prophets they had cut in half. And yet they still endured. Notice he says that still others had trial of mockings, scourgings, and chains, and imprisonment. He says they were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with a sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and in caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Now here, again, the pinnacle, the point of all of this. He says, if you go back and you look at the testimonies, you look at the faith of all of them in the Old Testament that you read about, and you see the lives that they lived, the lives that they endured, and the struggles that they faced, and yet they continued on. They didn't have the full promise. They didn't have the full gospel. But what they did have, even just a glimmer, they continued on. Why is he saying it? Because he's telling these Christians that are beginning to question. He says, don't go back. There's no going back. It is Christ and onward. That's it. He says you've got to press on because there's nothing. Again, there's nothing better than Jesus. Nothing better than Jesus. So then we go to Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12. And I want you to notice, in light of all of this, when you see therefore, you have to go back to what he was talking about prior. I know it takes a while. I know it's a long introduction. I only have 18 points. Not that many. But, therefore, in light of this, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And the cloud, the term here, it is not that it is a definite thing. It's not that you can just simply look at this idea of yes, it was described as a cloud. It's something that you can kind of see, but it's not fully defined. He's giving this depiction in a sense of being in an arena, in a coliseum, and you are there and you are in the midst ready. You are in a race. You are in some kind of fight, or you're there. People are watching you. There are spectators in a sense. They're witnessing, but they have gone on before. These are the ones that had been faithful, that had not received the promise. But boy, you're surrounded by them. You're surrounded by the lives they lived, by the faith that they had, by their endurance. And you may not know them personally, and you can't really pick them out in such a big crowd. I remember going to the Alabama and Tennessee game not long ago. I don't like crowds. I don't like waiting in line. I don't like crowds. Stephanie was like, oh, this is so exciting. I was like, what time is it? And sitting there in the very wonderfully comfortable seats. And again, I get it. Some do enjoy being there. I'm not good, but if I had my choice, I'd be. I noticed that if I had my choice, I'd just be on the field. I wouldn't be playing. I'd just be there. But and I did see where there were people that if you go, everybody can kind of stand and be standing right there. You can find a spot right there at a fence, and you're right there by the players watching. And that's kind of what I wanted to do, but we didn't have enough space, and we had assigned seats and everything else we had to go to. But again, can you really, if you're there and the players that are there, they know that there is a crowd that is watching. And you see that there are 120,000 people there. 120,000. And I was one of them. Waving on, and of course, people at the end, whenever they won, people, we won! We didn't win. They won. They played. We watched them play, but we didn't win. But again, here, the depiction that he's giving is this massive. You are in this arena and you have witnesses all around. And again, it may not be fully defined, but there have been so many thousands and millions that have gone on before, and they have pressed on in endurance. And you have that crowd that they're watching. He says, and because of this, that we've been surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, this would be, in a sense, the testimonies of all the lives that have gone on before. So I would say this, think about in your mind as you're preparing in this race, the first thing you want to do is you want to wave to the witnesses. And I say that because, again, the players would come out when they get ready, and it was a little more exhilarating to watch the basketball games. So let me just say that. And here's why. We got club tickets. So that was a lot more fun. You just go and get food and you come and sit down and get in the front row and watch and go back and get food. But you had the players that would come out, and boy, they would acknowledge. The crowd just cheers. Each player coming out, and they'd wave, and everybody, boy, just ready for them to get started, ready for the game. In our lives, we cannot lose sight of the fact that there have been many that have gone on before in faith, and they've endured. You're not the first. You're not the first. And even now, I think about yes, the writer here is focused on the ones in the Old Testament because he's making a point that they didn't even have the full gospel. But what they did have, they continued on. So how much more, when you've got the full gospel, should you press on in endurance? But I think about even the people that I've met in my life. One individual that sticks out to my mind, I pastored him in Georgia, in Alma, Georgia. His name is Henry Clay. Preached his funeral a few years ago. But a wonderful, godly individual. Served the Lord faithfully, loved his family. But I even remember when he was 82 years old, and we had another church get together. We went to this softball field. We were going to play volleyball and softball, and we had just a time of fellowship. And I think that y'all have done that in the past, haven't you? You've done some softball and things like that. And, I don't know if we can do that again. That may be too tough for some, but I remember he was 82 years old, and we did volleyball. And he got in there. I thought, brother, listen, you don't need to be playing volleyball. He said, I'm going to play. And he jumped and he spiked the ball. And he was short, probably about that high, but he spiked the ball. And then he landed wrong and he rolled down a hill. And I thought, oh man, I'm going to have to call the ambulance. 5 seconds later, he's back up playing. And I remember even after that, when we went to go eat, we went and ate, and then we were going to go and play softball. I thought he was going to be sitting in the corner kind of, just trying to relax and feel a little better. No, guess where he was? He was out there at the softball field. And he hit the ball and ran to first base, ran to second base. The next day I saw him, I said, Brother Henry, I said, do you need me to get you a wheelchair? I thought he was going to be sore and walking up, and I just was joking with him, and he just started jumping up and down. And I felt horrible because my back was hurting. But I think about his life. And when he would pray, and he would weep at times in his prayers, and he would just talk about the goodness of God and the love of God. And I look and I see, in the midst of the things that he had experienced, and pastoring him, and seeing that endurance in his life. Again, we have many that have gone on before. We have a cloud of witnesses. In the arena of faith, we have to understand, listen, you need to wave to the witnesses. You've got to realize there are many that have gone on before faithfully. The second thing is this. He says we've got to remove the hindrances. Notice what he goes on. He says, because of this, what do? We lay aside every weight, and the sin which so easily ensnares us. And that is the word here that it depicts, is the sense of things that are wrapping around us. It is circling around us and hanging on to us. And we can't hardly run in that race. I almost look at it in a sense when I'm sure you've had a dream before where you are trying to get away. Somebody's coming after you. And what happens in the dream? I mean, they're chasing and they're running hard, and you're going maybe a foot, and you're trying to go as fast as you can, and you can't do anything. Why? Because you're in REM sleep. You're in a state where your body, it's actually protecting you in a sense. If you're not in that state, and you actually got scared and tried to run, you would actually run out of your bed and probably kick, your spouse in the face or hit something or break things. And so your body's basically forcing you in the sense where it feels like you're just not going anywhere in that sleep. This depiction here, in this sense, is where you are allowing things to encumber your life, to hinder you. And it's just wrapped around you. And it may not even be sins, but it is things that you're consumed with. But he says, lay aside every weight and encumbrance and the sin in your life. This here, things that you struggle and that you've been struggling with for years. We all have different vices and different things that we face and struggle with, different temptations. But now here's the thing. We all serve a God who can give us the victory. But we have to lay aside and cast aside those things and get to the place where we say, God, I'm going to press on, I'm going to run, I'm going to toss this aside. No more the hindrances in my life. Look, I look at it as social media. I would say social media is a massive weight in people's lives. And that is causing it. They may not see it. They may think that they're doing a lot. And because we use the phone so many times, we don't even use it hardly ever to talk to anymore. We just use it simply for everything else. But it gets to the point where, and I say this for myself, where it gets to the point where, you've got to check an email, and then you're there for an hour. Well, I got to do this. That can be a weight. That can be an encumbrance. That we lose our focus in life. There are many things that can cause this. We have to remove the hindrances in our lives. We notice as he goes on, he says, lay aside the weight, the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run. The word in the King James is patience, but that word is endurance. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Let us run with endurance. We are called to endure and to continue on. He says, looking unto who? Unto Jesus. Unto Jesus. We look to the Master. It is similar what Paul says in Philippians 3. Notice, look here with me in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 13. Look what Paul states here. Philippians 3 and verse 13. Paul says, Philippians chapter 3 and verse 13, brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended. But one thing I do, I forget those things which are behind, and I reach forward to those things which are ahead. I press toward the goal, the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. This is similar when he says here, look, run with endurance and look unto Jesus Christ, the author and the finisher of our faith. You don't take your eyes off the prize. You don't take your eyes off the Master. You keep that focus. And everything else in this life, the hindrances that come in this world, the cares of this life, it can ensnare us, it can trap us, the sins that we hang on to, even if we say, well, it's just a little sin. I was friends with a guy years ago when I was a teenager, actually, and he was a teen, but we were in the same youth group, and at the same time, I had answered the call to preach. 15 years old. And it wasn't long after that he had said, well, I believe I'm called to preach. And so we gave a message in the youth group. I remember I was scared to death. I preached to the church. I begged the preacher over and over, I want to preach, I want to preach, I want to preach. And I go back and I'm like, man, why did you say those things standing there preaching about? I preached the scripture, but I also had a Pentecostal prayer book with me. And I was using some things out of that. And, again, just trying to formulate. And I think I spoke about 15 minutes, and who knows how much heresy I said. Probably a lot. But I remember we spoke in the same youth group and preached a message one night. And we became friends. But later on, he kind of just got to where he began seeing things that he shouldn't see. Listen to music that, again, I get it, where music's not a big problem. Well, the fact is what you hear and what you see with your eyes and everything that you consume constantly, the things he was listening to, the things he was watching, and the things that he was saying did not reflect someone who wanted to preach. And I would ask him about this. I'd say, why would you listen to this? Why would you look at these things? And he made this statement. He said, I'm just feeding my flesh a little. I'm just feeding my flesh a little. And this is how we treat life. I'm just doing a little bit. I just can't have, God, I'll give you this much, but can I just have this little bit? No, you can't. You know why? Because it becomes a trap, a snare, and it will cover your life. And you will not be able to run as God intends for you to run. Amen. Well, then, again, we go on. He says, look unto Jesus. That ultimately, we lay aside the sin, but we look unto Christ. We look to the Master. We press on. We forget the things that are behind. We press forward. And this is what he's telling me. He says, look, you've got to focus on Christ. I talked about the sleeping and trying to run. I remember I experienced this, what is called sleep paralysis. I don't know if anybody else has ever experienced this. It is a strange phenomenon that what happens is your body, you will be asleep, you'll wake up, you're conscious, you see things around you, but you cannot move. You are still in a state where you are just paralyzed, and the body thinks that you are still sleeping, but you're not. And then what happens when you're in that sleep paralysis is that you begin to hear things and see things while you're awake. That happened to me one time. And I remember seeing a cloud form over my bed and began to hear voices. And it sounded like devilish, demonic voices. I remember just laying there, not being able to move. I wanted to run out of the room. And I laid there, and all I could do was say, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And it began to subside. And I could say it louder, Jesus, 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 Jesus. And it went away. Look unto Christ. Focus on Him. In this race, in this arena that we are in, this arena of faith, we continue to look to Him. And the fact is this, we endure to the end. This is what He's telling them. He says, you've got to endure and press on. Press on in faith. He says, look in verse 3, consider Him who endured such hostility from sinners against Himself, lest you become weary and faint in your minds, discouraged in your souls. He says, understand, realize what Christ endured. The fact is we've got to focus on the love of Jesus Christ. What He went through for us. Even while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He says in verse 4, you've not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. Now that's very interesting, but he says, the fact is that you're not at the point where you're going to die for your faith. You've been persecuted, you've been ridiculed, but you're not at that point. Yet, he says, look, why are you turning back? Why are you trying to flee? He says, you're in this race of life. You've got to run to the end. You've got to endure. Now look, I hate running. I know it's hard to tell. I hate running. I know Brother Vince apparently loves running, enjoys it. I think to myself, who would ever run? But when I was in college, hard to believe, but I was a very fast runner, very fast. And in the football that we did, I was on defense when I wasn't working. In one of the games, I got 5 sacks. They were run, go through, and I remember one time, but again, I had to be in the game. I had to be in a basketball game. I wasn't that great of a shooter. I could get by everybody, but once it was wide open, what do you do? But I had a guy ask me one time, he said, hey, I ain't got a running department. You want to run with me? They're in college. And it was right after I got off of work. And I said, I don't know, but come on, I need a running department. The first time, man, my stamina was gone just like that. And he just, I was keeping up with him. I thought, oh, this is easy. About the next 5 minutes, I wanted to collapse. But then I kept on, continuing. And amazingly, my endurance continued stronger and stronger and stronger. Do you know the problem? The problem is, after a while, when you just sit and you do very little. If you don't use it, you what? Lose it. We're called to endure. And in this race, we have to press on. We have to continue. We have to be faithful and steadfast. Why? Because there are so many that have gone before. And even in the promises that they didn't have the full gospel, they didn't have the full glimpse, the full picture. We don't have to the fullest extent, but we have something far more than they ever did. How could we sit back and do nothing? We have received this gospel that calls us to run, not to sit behind, not to lag behind, not to sit on the sidelines, but to press on. And if not for that, but for the Master himself who has endured to the very end. We are called to continue to press on and endure to the end. What about in your life?